For this video, I'm excited to share with you a little bit about Ashley Wood, who's both a comic book and fine artist. And what I love is the mixture of the two. The artist loves to bring together these highly gestural, almost street art approaches to painting, where there's a mixture of energetic, almost gestural ink work and pencil work that then gets rendered in a fine art manner using oil paint. It makes the layering and the energy and the kind of illustrative approaches and that kind of very unique voice to the subject matter that makes this artwork really, really fun. I take a lot of inspiration from it just for attitude and energy and intent. And it's just the kind of artwork that stands alone in kind of my view of the kind of spectrum of art that's out there. So let's get inspired by Ashley Wood, and then we'll move forward with our own painting that kind of takes some cues from this. Let's get to it. Hey all, and welcome. This is going to be our painting inspired by Ashley Wood's art. Ashley Wood, like we talked about, comic book and fine artist. We're going to take some inspiration from his subject matter as well as the style here and just draw a little robot. And maybe on top of the robot, we'll have like a woman who's kind of just like sitting upon him with some kind of bombastic pose. The thing I like about Ashley Wood, you know, in addition to the things I talked about in the intro, is the subject matter kind of fits with that, that part of me that sketched really fantastical kind of sci-fi stuff all in my childhood. And I think Ashley Wood inspires me to let that stuff out and just have fun with it. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to have fun. We're going to use the watercolors. We're going to lay in a bunch of colors and just let everything drip and mix and blend. It doesn't matter if it's the skin tones or if it's the metal or the rust on the robot. It's all just going to kind of be put in this really loose and smudgy kind of wet media style way. Something that Rebelle is incredibly good at. And that brings us to the point of this video, which is that Rebelle is incredibly good at wet media. And Ashley Wood is one of those artists that you couldn't reproduce unless you were either doing this stuff with actual watercolor and oils or using Rebelle. So a lot of the artists that I've brought in this series have been artists that you just couldn't reproduce any other way. And Ashley Wood is another one of those. And not that we're going to try and reproduce his work here. What we're going to do is just be inspired by it. Now, this is, you know, an artist that I bring to this video because I love this kind of stuff. I love that kind of pulpy, over the top, sci-fi stuff. And it's kind of like, is it dystopian? Is it whatever? But, you know, it's got a high focus on energy, on gesture, on, like I said in the intro, on attitude. And one of the ways we're going to get to that is with the warp tool. So you can go into, you know, select an area, you can get into and warp the drawing. Something I love about that is, you know, you might have a decent gestural approach in your sketch, but with the warp tool, you can just push it even further. You know, you don't have to do all that redrawing. You can just kind of warp and twist it into what you need it to be right away. Now, what we learn when we look at Ashley Wood's painting is that there's like a nice underpainting, and then he'll often come on top of it with these masks of more opaque and solid color. And we're going to do a little bit of that with the sky. We're going to do a little bit of that with kind of, well, everything here. And if you mask in with a solid, flat kind of stroke, then it's going to look, you know, very solidly opaque. But if you come in and mask over it with a really bristly stroke, this is all just brush choice here, you can kind of get the benefit of having the underpainting show through. It gives it some of that kind of raw street art, gritty vibe. So, you know, just choose wisely, I guess. I'm using a little bit of both here. A lot of the brushes I use in this series and almost all of my paintings are custom brushes, and custom brushes are something that are quite easy to make in Rebelle, but if you're interested in accessing my brushes, you can find them in a couple different places online, but mostly I would just encourage you guys to try to make your own brushes and have fun going into the forums on the Rebelle community website and see what everybody's sharing there, see what's going on. Everybody has such cool stuff, and there's a really great community in the forums and kind of just online in general. There's a lot of different places where you can meet artists using these tools and kind of see what they've got and what's working for them. And what works for me is a lot of times my own brushes. I like having a very specific way of working. I I like working in a way that fits my very specific oil painting style, something that comes from my traditional painting background. But you are going to gravitate toward what works for you. And what works for me is this. I really like having this kind of loose, watery underpainting and then having these bristly dry brush up on top of it. I just think it looks great. Even though my figure is still really loose and kind of uncoordinated, looks a little weird at this point. You know, it don't really have the drawing sorted out. It's all very, very kind of haphazard at this point. I still feel like it's going in the right direction, roughly. One of the nice things about this approach that the artist has, Ashley Wood has, is that things are very stylized. Things are very minimalist. So you're not getting into a huge amount of modeling or gradation or, you know, the tonal variation between lights, midtones, and darks. You're really keeping things very graphic, very simple, and kind of harsh in terms of the value transitions. And that makes for a speedy approach to the painting. So it's fun, it's fast, and it meets the genre really well to paint this way. One thing that's tough in this piece is that I didn't come to it with any pre-draw. You know, a lot of times I'll just look at something and be like, wow, that's really fun, and I just jump in. And that's just, you know, me like maybe trusting a little bit all the decades of being a fine artist here. But I know in a perfect world, the best practice is I would sit down, do some thumbnails, do some refinement, go through an ideation process, and kind of work through towards a really good composition. But for the purposes of a quick demo like this, I'm just going to kind of jump right in. And one of the things I wanted to point out is stylization. So I'm stylizing the anatomy, I'm stylizing the pose, I'm stylizing the kind of proportions to exaggerate this feeling of motion. And I'm using a lot of bristly brush strokes that are showing the underpainting so that everything is pointing in that same direction, that direction being energy. I want this to be energy, energy, energy. And then another thing, it's like the shoe. You know, if you can see her one shoe that's out up in the air, out over on the right side of the canvas, that shoe, again, very stylized. You know, and then in her other hand, maybe it's going to be a blaster or phaser or some kind of sci-fi pistol or something. Also very stylized. At this point, it just looks ridiculous. But the idea here is just play. I'm just kind of sorting it out. I'm allowing myself to work out the design problems on the canvas. And here, you know, one of those design problems is, what if I foreshorten the arm, put the blaster pistol pointed straight at the camera or just a little bit up? And like, you can see me just working back and forth, trying to decide what I like. How do I want to balance the pose? I've got one leg kicked out, way far out. Do I need to have an arm balancing that posture, balancing that pose by having an arm go out to the other direction? And maybe not. So I just kind of am sorting this out. I like the leg up. I like the other leg down. I like where the one arm is. And I'm just sort of figuring out what that other arm is going to do. So it's just a matter of making some choices. I do like this though, where the drips and all the watercolor layering is coming in. It's really starting to feel like an Ashley Wood inspired piece, which is really fun. So now I'm just adding some extra colors, some different variety of tones, and it's just bringing this a little more to life. I really want to have a lot of color in this piece. And even though it's a kind of a minimalist color palette, I want to have a lot of variation. I don't want the sky to be blue. I don't want the clouds to be white, right? I want them to be kind of have this vintage tonal situation going on, but I want them to kind of have a lot of variation in those whites, in those blues, in those grays, in those tans. And I'm doing that with layering, letting some of the water drip and letting some of those interesting happenstances occur when you start putting wet on wet, basically, and letting in this case, have the tilt of the canvas as far down as possible, letting all of that kind of wet media watercolor interaction happen and letting all those interesting edges develop as a result. And you can see I'm just playing with different intensities and saturations and more drips and layers. And all this is on a new layer, literally a new layer. So I can kind of play with it and change it and play with it and change it. And as you can see here, I've actually changed the hand finally to something that sort of works for me, which is to have the one hand resting on that kind of globe fishbowl helmet, and the other one is pressed down onto the quote unquote lid of the robot's eye. I think I'm going to go ahead and just jump in here, zoom in, and kind of put a little bit more detail into the cheeks, into the chin, into a little bit of the anatomy. Even though it's very loose and it's very simplistic, I am going to add a little more to it. It just make it feel a little bit more alive. And I like using, in a situation like this, I like keeping the original artist, Ashley Wood's inspiration image there right below my reference image, which is with this woman with red hair. And, I can either color sample from either of those, or I can just kind of make my own colors inspired by that. But really, I want to kind of find a way to paint something that is inspired by the original artist, but is still mine. And this is the kind of artwork that is just pure fun to make. As you can see, it happens quickly. The rendering is easy. It's not the kind of artwork that you have to sweat over too much. It's made to be fun, and it feels good to paint. And you can see here, I'm using the oil brush, and I'm just putting in some tonal variation to give the cloud some dimension. I'm trying to paint in, thinking just about the simple, the painting principles. So we've got a light source that creates highlights, and on the opposite side of those forms are shadows. In the middle, there's midtones, and you just, kind of going around, identifying where darks would be, identifying where lights would be, identifying how much detail needs to be there. Do we need to have nails? Do we need to have individual fingers? Do we need to have a wrist with a watch on it? Do we need to, they're just kind of, I'm thinking through all this stuff. How much of the raw underpainting can I leave? How much of the refinement needs to happen to make it kind of fit? And in this case, because number one, it's a demo. Number two, it's the stylistic approach. I want to leave things pretty raw. I'm going to paint in a random sword here behind her, maybe a sword on her back, just kind of playing to that like sci-fi fantasy hybrid. And then, I don't know if I'll keep it or not, but I always just have to try it, and that's the thing with digital, is it's so fun and so easy to just try stuff and see if it works. I would call this digital sketchbooking. I'm just playing in my digital sketchbook, exploring where the lights and the shadows should be, seeing what I need to push, and that's it pretty much. I mean, I could go in and paint kneecaps. I could go in and paint different amounts of sheen on the skin. I could go in and do all kinds of things. But for the purpose of this study, which is to show that Rebelle is amazing and it can handle this kind of artwork, and to have fun with this subject, I think this is enough. So there you go. Thank you so much for checking it out.